Okay, can you guys see it?
Yep.
Okay. So, hello everyone. My name is Romulo. I'm a PhD student from Brazil, from Federal University of Ceará, and I'm going to present the work entitled "Family Relations on Top Management and Ownership Concentration: How do they affect CSR engagement of Brazilian companies?" Well, I actually got the idea for this work when I was reading a paper from French Schmidt and others about varieties of institutional systems, and when they comment about how relevant ownership concentration and family power are to in this context, how they play a major role defining companies' decisions. And then I looked at Brazil, and if we think about, for example, our industrialization process, which relied heavily on family wealth, which generated a highly concentrated market, there is a ideal setup to study these conditions on how they would affect CSR of Brazilian companies. So that's why I think it's relevant to see how the family presence at the top management and the ownership concentration may affect how our companies engage in CSR practices. So when I look at the literature, what have I found? I found that companies with high family involvement, they care more about their company legacy because they have a social emotional wealth related to their decision. So this would make it easier for them to engage in CSR practices. So family companies, the literature says, engage more in CSR practices because they care about their company's legacy. While for ownership concentration, what I found was that companies with dispersed ownership they suffer greater pressure from stakeholders. So companies with high ownership would engage less because they suffer less pressure from their stakeholders. What? So to do that, we have assembled a sample of A6 Brazilian public listed companies from 2010 to 2017, which totalize 557 observations. Okay, we got this data from a data set called CSR Hub. They have several indicators for CSR for companies CSR, and we focused on environmental practices. They have three indicators for to assess companies' environmental practices. They have one indicator for energy and climate change practices, another one for environment policy and reporting, and another one for resource management. Okay, and this is our dependent variables. And to explain this, we looked at the ownership concentration of Brazilian companies, which is the percentage of common stocks of the largest shareholder, and family relations in top management, which is the number of relations on the board of directors and board of executives. And to explain that, we have our analysis had two steps. We started with descriptive statistics and then a set of random effects panel regressions, where we included some control variables like company size, leverage, and variation in revenue. So here we have the descriptive statistics for the main variables. I would like to highlight here that we can see, or looking for the average of the environmental variables, that we have a slight lower score for climate change practices and a slightly higher scores for reporting practices and resource management practices. But climate change practices have a higher variability. So even though they have the lower average and a lower range, they have a higher variability among Brazilian companies in our sample. When you look at ownership concentration, we see that our sample had on average 55% of their shares on the largest shareholder for the largest shareholder, and at least half of the companies in our sample had a shareholder with 50% of the shares. as for the family relations, what we see, which surprised me is that 90% of our sample had up to 2 family relations in the top management. I would expect more engagement of families, but that's what the data showed us. So coming to the regression, what can we see? We see that for the family relation, they have a negative and significant effect on the 3 variables for our that measure our environmental engagement. While for ownership concentration, you have a positive effect on reporting practices and resource management practices, and a positive significant effect, and it wasn't significant for climate change practices. Okay. So what do you think these results show us? First, they diverge from the mainstream literature that argues that families with high family engagement would engage more in CSR practices. Here, the results we have for the Brazilian companies show the other way around. They engage less in environmental practices, which may be related to that social emotional wealth in Brazil and for Brazilian companies would make them more selfish about their goals, like what Kellerman says, or at least that the social emotional wealth of Brazilian companies is not associated with environmental practices that can be related to employees' practices or community practices, another type of practices, but not environmental practices. And also, we see that companies with high ownership concentration in Brazil, they use CSR in an instrumental way, since they engage more in practices of reporting and resource management, but they don't engage more in practices of climate change. Okay, so we think that they engage more in practices where the benefits from that investment are more tangible. So we think that these results point out to the need to consider the context where the companies operate to explain how family relationship and ownership concentration can impact the engaging in CSR practices. Okay, and that's it.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Romulo. That was speedy, and it's like the paper that I liked very much because it's very analytical, very well written.